So my plan for today is to get my Scuz-Z, the Scuz-Z, the old SRX, and my Indy 650 down from their summer perch up on the shelf behind me. But to do that, I pretty much got to move everything in the shop. Thankfully, almost everything will fire up, although I'm a little bit worried about the cab over, and the green Mustang, well, there's no carburetor on that motor, so I'm pushing it. Ta-da! It's winter. You know what? A little dusty from sitting all summer, but overall I'm pretty happy with the condition that they're in, and I'm really happy they made it down to the floor without falling off the lift. Now, we're going to start work on the Scuz-Z here by putting a new set of Wiseco pistons in, but the first thing I'm going to do to this old girl is give it a little TLC wipe down. Last season, this Scuz-Z joined the crew and became a big part of the year, along with a bunch of other triple sleds. Now for fun, I plowed out a quarter-mile run out in the lake that let us take these old sleds on the ice to blow the cobwebs out of the exhaust. Working and racing on this old stuff was so much fun. The Scuz never failed to fail. 3 tracks came apart on this thing on the ice, and despite throwing a whole bunch of new parts at it, it never ran my top speed goal of 107 miles an hour to at least equal that exquisite XCR that Rich brought out. Even after installing reeds, the best number we ever got out of the Scuz was 104 miles an hour, but that was testing without any cameras around, so you have to take my word for it. And oh, by the way, the sled has continued to shed studs out of the track. So I need 3 more miles an hour out of the Scuz here to match Rich on that XCR, and I have a plan to do that, and it's with these. A new set of pistons from Wiseco that we're going to install, but before we do that, I'm going to fire the Scuz up for the first time this year, hopefully without pulling it over 3,000 times. We'll warm it up and do a compression test just to see how bad this thing really is. To get the sled started, I'm going to cheat the fuel pump a little bit and use some compressed air to fill up the float bowls and the carbs. Now, this is a little bit more civilized than going straight to the brake cleaner to start the sled. Just remember not to pressurize the system too much with air. That could end badly. There's 5. 7 pulls. That's not bad. This thing is Scuz-Z. Oh, triples sound awesome. With the sled warm, it's time to do a compression test. To do that, you'll need a compression tester. Now, these things are easy to come by and inexpensive, and the procedure is a simple one too. With all the spark plugs out of the engine and the gauge line threaded in, simply pull the engine over a few times, and the amount of pressure generated by the compression stroke will be recorded on the gauge. Just repeat this for each cylinder. What a compression test reveals is really the health of your engine, and what you're looking for is how your old engine, like this one, compares to what it was when it was brand new. For a Scuz-Z, typically, according to the internet, they would produce just a little bit more than 150 psi per cylinder. The Scuz actually is better than I thought it was going to be at 145, 145, and then 130 down here on the PTO side. Now, this, I think, is just an old engine. But what you're looking for when you're doing a compression test is relatively even numbers across all cylinders. And if you find one that's wildly different, not only it could mean that there's a problem with that cylinder, but it could mean the problem goes beyond what a piston and ring kit can fix. It could mean that your cylinder wall has got a score in it, which means you're either boring that cylinder out or having to change that jug entirely. What a compression test can reveal is a good reason to bring a gauge with you for whenever you're thinking about buying a used sled. There still might be other engine problems, but a good compression test result is peace of mind. With the goal of freshening up the engine on the Mach-Z, hopefully to find a few more ponies that'll improve the top end performance, we're going to install a complete new piston kit from Wiseco into the engine. Now, even though the compression test showed actually decent results, I'm confident that new pistons and rings are going to breathe a little bit more life into that tired old Scuz-Z engine. We chose to go with standard bore sizes with the new Wisecos, which means they're the same diameter as the stock pistons and will work with the stock cylinders. Now, Wiseco does sell kits with oversized pistons as well for times when you need to overbore a cylinder to clean up any damage from something like a broken ring or a burnt piston. This engine didn't suffer any kind of catastrophic engine damage, it's just older, and that's why we went with the standard bore piston set. Now, Wiseco has pistons with up to a 5mm oversize, and that would bring this 809 up to 889 cc's, but that's just crazy talk. And there would have to be significant work done to the jugs to accept this kind of kit. For the Scuz-Z, I'm not looking for that kind of performance, not yet anyways. Installing new pistons into a two-stroke isn't really a bad job and can be done by just about anyone with reasonable mechanical skills. Plus, there's also tons of tutorials and videos online walking you through this process for just about any engine combination. Just remember, this process is basically just nuts and bolts, but a lot of them. You'll be digging around pretty deep in the engine, so there might be a bunch of stuff that'll need to be moved out of the way. One great thing about these older chassis is the access to the top of the engine. You might need a second elbow to get into the tighter, more modern machines. The carb placement on the lower cases means we can leave them in place. And with the pipes out of the way, the next job is draining all of the coolant. Now, we are going to replace all the coolant, so I'm draining the entire system. You may not have to drain as much as long as the upper engine half is dry. Or maybe you've got an air-cooled engine, in which case you're probably already starting to put the thing back together by now. The Wiseco kit comes with all the gaskets you'll need to do this job, including base and head gaskets, even ones for the rave valves. Then for the pistons themselves, the kit includes new wrist pins, retainers, and new rings. The pistons even show up in plush velvety bags you can use to hold your marbles. Okay, so now we're at the part where we've got the pistons exposed in here, and that didn't take long at all. Now, from this point forward, I like to disassemble everything off the connecting rods, clean everything up, and then start reassembly. But this is also the part of the job that can have the most disastrous results, and that's because you have to get the wrist pins and pistons out of the connecting rods, and some engines, and I believe this is one of them, do not have caged wrist pin needle bearings. And what that means is when you pull the wrist pin out and you take the piston off, the little needle bearings that are in there, well, they can fall out and go everywhere. And one thing, you need the needle bearings for reassembly, but if you were to lose one down in the case, that is no bueno, and you have to get it out of there. And when they fall in, fishing them out of the case is not fun at all. No bueno. And that's what's next. All right, so this is the point where things can go bad. Oh, hey, look at that. Interesting. I thought this was an uncaged needle bearing set, but this one has a cage in it. Now, this is what I was talking about earlier. All these little needle bearings, they're now in a cage on this particular engine. I didn't think the cage existed. Now, it's these needle bearings you have to watch falling out and going everywhere. Now, despite these being in a cage, still take precautions with towels to make sure nothing goes down into the bottom of the motor anyways, but this is a win. This job just got easier. There's a couple of things to know on reassembly after the engine cases are all cleaned up. The first is to orient the pistons to the front. Now, there's usually a little arrow pointing to the exhaust, so make sure they're pointed the right way. Then carefully push the wrist pins through the connecting rod, making sure you have a little bit of lube on them. I use 2-stroke oil and I find it works just fine. Then you'll have to fight with the second retainer clip. Now, these things are springy and will easily fly out, lost forever under the engine, so take your time with this job. Next up on the reassembly of the Scuz-Z engine is to install the rings. Now, there's a few details to remember on these things. We're taking the ring, putting it in the cylinder bore, taking the piston, shoving it down so it's equal in there, then taking a 12 thou feeler gauge and we're checking the end gap. The end gap is the distance between the two ends of the ring while it's in the cylinder bore, and we're right on spec, so that one is good. Now to better show you what I'm talking about the pin inside the ring groove, I'm using these old pistons. You can see there's one in the top groove and in the bottom groove. Now that pin is there to orient the ring to keep it from rotating and getting hung up inside the exhaust ports. Now, one thing to watch for, especially on reassembly with the jug, is to make sure that the ring is sitting around that pin, because if it's not, it's actually going to hold the ring up out of the ring groove a little bit, making the jug really hard to go on, actually impossible. And if you do get the jug on, that means you've probably broken a ring or done some other damage, so this is really something to pay attention to. With the pistons and rings assembled on the rods, I'm going to turn my attention to the cylinders or jugs. These will have to be honed to allow the new rings to seal properly. You can take them to a professional shop to have them done there, or like in this case, you can DIY it with a hand drill and a hone tool. With a bit of lubricant and the drill on low speed, move the hone up and down to create the proper crosshatch necessary to seat the rings. Now this doesn't take long, and you want to remove as little material as possible. I'm also doing this job in a bucket just to keep the mess a little bit more contained. After honing, you'll have to thoroughly clean the cylinders. A wash tank or even soap and water will work. Just make sure you dry everything off perfectly and spray it down with some lube or light oil, because the freshly machined cylinders will rust very quickly. With the cylinders back in place, install the new gaskets to seal against the head, and then top off the engine with the head itself. From this point, all the fasteners need to be installed and torqued to manufacturer's spec and in the sequence they suggest as well. So at this point, we're ready to throw the jugs on the pistons. I've already got a couple of them done. Now to help this job out, there's a chamfer on the bottom of the cylinder to get those rings to help guide them inside, but you're gonna have to use your fingers as well to help squeeze them and get them in there. Just remember to line up the rings on those little pins in the ringland. So at this point, we're pretty much done with the Scuz here. I've got to put coolant back in it and assemble the pipes, and then we're going to fire it up again, because I want to do another compression test just to find out if all of this work has been worth it, which I'm sure it has. Plus, I painted the Rotax on the top of the head, so that's worth another mile an hour on the top end for sure. That XCR is going down. So after warming this thing up, the compression test tells me I got 150 PSI across the board, which is pretty good, and it's only going to get better after a proper break-in procedure, but that's going to happen after the snow comes and the ice forms on the lake. And when that ice is on the lake, I tell you, that XCR is going down. But that's going to be on a future episode of Snowmobiler Television.